So I'm Jill Adams. I work for Onward Behavioral Health. We are a company that treats adolescents, adults with mental health, substance use, and eating disorders. I'm currently an executive director, but my background is in adolescent substance use treatment. So we're here today just to really talk about adolescent THC use specifically, or cannabis use specifically, and kind of want to get everyone's perspective on that. So we'll just do some introductions. If you want to go ahead and start.
Sure. So my name is Javanch. I'm a senior in high school. And I just my teacher at school reached out to me basically asking if I could do this and just volunteered.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm Emily. I'm a person in recovery, so I have a lot of experience with THC and substance abuse, and yeah.
Okay.
And I'm Tammy. I'm a local parent of a child within a school district here in the region and have an interest in the topic and interested in discussing today.
To kind of kick us off with our conversation, one of the big focuses I think for us to start out with is how THC use can impact an adolescent's mental health. So do you all have any thoughts on that at all before I kind of give my perspective?
I mean, I guess I can start. I don't know exactly, but from what we learned in school, cannabis is a drug, and I just like to simplify drugs are bad. So naturally, I would assume it would have a negative impact on cognitive development. So kind of like alcohol, they tell us, okay, you have to be over 21 because below 21, it's going to have like impacts on your brain development. So I assume it would have a similar impact.
Yeah, I think as a parent, I think, development obviously is really important, coming through, young teens through adolescence. So I think development, memory, working memory, especially like children who, or I should say, teens, adolescents that are still developing their executive functioning skills is so critical because they're just so much needed, especially today in, a high-paced educational environment, that we have here. I think it's really something that's important, that kids are, developing without having any hinders, to that. Obviously, as a parent thinking about how that might impair their success is something that's really important. So, I just think from all perspectives there, we want to make sure as a parent, our children are being as successful as they can in life. And obviously, if there is anything out there that hinders that from happening, it's really important that, there's control over that.
Absolutely.
I can kind of corroborate what both of you were saying as someone who I started using THC when I was about 14 and eventually became a daily user for about 4 years or so, and it definitely stunted my brain development in a really big way.
How did you feel that? Like, how do you see that now?
I mostly feel it actually as a person in recovery, learning that my coping mechanisms just aren't fully there. A lot of interpersonal skills and modes of communication that I think people learn when they're adolescents are not as developed in me, and there's something I'm working on now as a person in my mid-20s, because the THC or whatever other substance I was using to kind of shut off my brain functioning it did all the work for me, or it just distracted from the work of like growing up, so I am now just learning how to live as a human in a lot of ways. And I think something you're told is that when you're a person in recovery is that when you get sober, you end up starting at the age where you first started using. So sometimes I do feel like I have the emotional intelligence of a 14-year-old, or like the relational skills of a 14-year-old. I mean, now I guess I would be like 16 and a half or 17. But yeah, I think some things that maybe come naturally to people my age who have not necessarily been affected by a substance use disorder are things that are not as intuitive to me still. So I would say it affected my development in that way. I mean, it undoubtedly affected my schoolwork and my success in a lot of ways. Mostly my success in school. I think once I started using daily, it was success in relationships also. There was a lot of like isolation. At first it was a social thing to do, and then it kind of became not a social thing to do, and the social withdrawal, I think, definitely affected a lot of relationships that I had.
How do you think it was impacting your mental health as a teenager when you were currently, or when you were actively using? And as you're increasing your use, in terms of like anxiety, depression, anything like that?
Yeah, I think kind of as I was saying before, it just kind of distracted from the work that I could have been doing to receive treatment for my mental health issues. I do have like underlying mental health issues like depression and anxiety, and at first it kind of felt like a way to actually treat those things, but then the drugs became the problem in a lot of ways, and so now the outcome would have had to be the same either way. It would have had to be like, I only make progress working on myself if I'm sober. So it definitely impacted my mental health in the long run in a really negative way. And I think because I'm someone who suffers from depression and anxiety, I also, particularly with THC, always continued to use it because I thought that it helped, because that's what I heard from the medical community, honestly, was that it was going to help me. And I thought for some reason it was different for me, or I should keep trying it because it wasn't helping me. Which that's like the insanity of being really wrapped up in a substance abuse disorder. But I truly thought that it was supposed to help alleviate my symptoms, and the impact of my use actually made my symptoms a lot worse. So like the impact of my use was I wasn't doing as well in school, I was withdrawing socially, I was really financially like unstable and dishonest, and all of that just contributed even more to the underlying mental health issues that I was originally trying to treat.
Thank you for sharing all of that. That's definitely, I think that coincides with what I see for sure. So we have a program specifically treating kids with mental health and substance use disorders, and it's a partial hospital. So our clients come in they're suicidal a lot of the time. They are severely depressed, they have anxiety and trauma, and then they're using substances on top of that. And a lot of times, when we are doing assessments, the kids are saying, well, I'm using this for anxiety. This is helping my anxiety. And one of the first things that we say are, if it's helping, why are you sitting in front of us? And that's like a conundrum at times to kind of see them process, because you're telling us that this is something you're using to self-medicate, but you're still needing professional help at this level specifically. So we have to, as like professionals, break down the barriers of what kids are hearing in the community and seeing with their friends. And what they're hearing right now is that it's almost completely legal, and it's used to treat anxiety, it's used to treat depression, it's used to treat like the physical pain issues. And the reality is, in terms of treating anxiety and mental health disorders, it's really not been proven to be successful in that area, and there's just not as much information to say that that's even a thing at this point. So with adolescents specifically, when you're putting substances into your body and your brain isn't developed until you're like 25, 26, you are stunting your growth developmentally and emotionally. So you are really impacting your ability to develop naturally. So what you're saying makes a ton of sense, for sure. And I think, one of the things that we see with our kids when they're coming in is, we have to kind of make a deal. We'd say, if you're struggling to stop this use, how can we get you to a point where, we have a day, we have 2 days, we have 3 days with you, and we kind of have to strike a deal with them to let them know we're going to take this a day at a time with you, or if you can give us 3 days, at 3 days, we're going to really sit down and talk about how much more time you can give us. And we just chip away in chunks because they really are dependent on it and don't have always an understanding as to how it's negatively impacting them. So what we say is, we might see a spike in your anxiety because you're not using, we might see a decrease in your anxiety because you're not using, but we don't know how to help you if you're continuing to put this stuff in your system. So I think it's when we're talking about how it's co-occurring, it gets complicated at times. And we need kids and parents to kind of like believe in the professionals to be able to make some changes. So from the parents' perspective, what's your thought on like the messaging behind THC or marijuana, cannabis use? And how do you think that plays out with yourself and other fellow parents?
Well, I think to some degree, there's a desensitization that's occurring. I think there's a lot of access that's around us. So, even though cannabis isn't necessarily recreational legal yet in Pennsylvania, we're hearing about it in New Jersey and, other states that obviously have had it legal for many, many years. So I think that, I think to some degree, it's a messaging that's out there. And I think parents are just, they're almost like it's in the background, and there is some belief, there's validity to what it can do and how it can help people, that or people have opinions and they just don't share them. So I think then to some degree, there are generations of parents that feel, okay, like we're not going to talk about this because either, they have a son or daughter, that a child, whatever that's using, and there's a stigma around that, for some parents, or it's just a matter of, okay, well, if there is like an efficacy to the treatment that can be positive, they endorse it as a parent, and they're actually not looking at other parents for validation to that. So, they promote that, within their own family household. But I feel like to a large degree, I don't think parents are talking about it enough. I think either they're just not aware that it's going on, or again, like it's just, it's something they glaze over because, you hear about it in the news and you see a True Leaf or whatever, Curaleaf on every corner. So I think some of it is it's just there, it's in the background. I think sometimes there's a denial also that like, okay, well, that's not my son or daughter, he or she, they're doing very good in school. They've got, good grades and they're playing sports and they have activities and things that are going on. Like that couldn't be in my house. So I think to some degree there is that denial that's there. And there's also like a fear to share that, that people don't want to come out about because they're afraid.
Do you think there's any component to where parents might, I think maybe you are saying parents are hearing that there is some efficacy. So maybe in some way being quiet about it is almost believing that it could help their child, but also maybe not wanting to head on address something that's going on with their kid that's scary. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think I understand what you're saying. So like, first of all, it is scary. No one wants to deal with that with their child. I mean, it's a very, like, again, it's a very important thing. You want your child to be perfect and successful and just achieve in every way possible. And you don't want to think that that's something that could impact you. So I think that there's that mask that, you kind of put over and, kind of fearful, like you don't, almost like you don't want to know. So like you may suspect, or maybe there's been some like subtle hints that your child has dropped at different times that, that you're just like, well, no, like nothing's overt. And I think some of it is too, is that, there's an ability to get away with it in a household today to where, the parent might not be aware, just genuinely, it's just sort of like, ignorant to it and just not aware of what's going on. So I think there's definitely a fear. I think there's a political piece to it also. Like, I think folks feel like it's being endorsed. So what's wrong with it? Like it's out there and, there's leadership across our country that has taken this on and supported it. So what's so bad about it? And maybe they feel like, okay, like when I grew up, yeah, sure, everybody tried it, and then you move on, like you get to a point in your life where it's like, okay, like you can sort of like do an about face. But that was a different generation, obviously when that occurred. And now today we're learning that, children are being exposed to it, in elementary school. And again, having that all around you now, like, geographically having the ability to obtain it, I think just makes everybody, again, just more desensitized to it.
Do you think parents are aware of the impact that THC has on or can have on an adolescent versus an adult, and what the differences are between cannabis now versus, when they're growing up? Do you think that that's a clear understanding or no?
I don't think it is, but I don't want to pretend to know what, all the parents are listening to. I might be a biased parent because I try to like learn about this stuff and understand what's going on. I also work in a profession with a lot of youths as well, so it's something that's really important to me. So I do think that more education is needed about not only like what the impact is on development, because I think really, unless you're in child development or psychology, you maybe don't really even understand, how the brain develops. So I think unless you learned about that and understand the stages of how that works, and, a lot of people, like you said earlier, like people don't develop until they're 25, 26. I don't think people realize that. They think, once you, break through the teen craziness, that it's, everybody's an adult and ready to go, 16, 18, when they're ready to drive and vote. So it brings up a lot of other issues, of course, driving. But I do think to some degree, there's not enough education about that, especially the THC portion, and how the percentage content is exponentially grearer than what it ever was in, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when all the previous generations, were, trying, cannabis in different forms. And that's the other thing, the formats are different.
Yeah.
So I think that right there, increases content. And I don't think parents are aware of that. And, again, I think if everything's going well and, your children seem to be adjusted to school and, not really having any issues, I don't think you really think about it. But more education is definitely needed. And personally, I think it starts, within the schools and the community and all of that. And it really takes everybody to tune into it to really understand what's going on, and hopefully to reverse a lot of the positives that are put out there about it.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your thought?
Yes, so I'd say from like a student's perspective, I agree with a lot of things you said. Those things are happening a lot with students as well. Like for me, for instance, I watch the news sometimes, and sometimes it talks about, okay, marijuana is being legalized in different states. And then when you hear other students talk about, okay, cannabis is basically, okay, like the state's legalizing and things like that. Okay, it's just being talked about more. So people think, at least from the student side, that it might be more socially acceptable, or like there might not be as harm in doing it. So that's just put in the back of your mind. And then like when there's some kind of event that pushes you to start trying it, then like that cycle starts of, okay, you start using it more and more and more till like you get to a point where it's just so bad. So, and then the events that might actually push you to start using it, I think there might be like 3 types of things from what I've seen. One, maybe it's like workload or academic environment or extracurriculars, things like that. You're just stressed out from everything. So you think like, okay, drugs might be able to help me cope with that. So people might just try to use cannabis because they see that it might be helpful based on what's in their background, what we just talked about. But so, and then that might start the cycle. 2 other things I saw is like, people might introduce you to it. Someone might say like, okay, you want to try this, and just because you want to be accepted by society, someone might like succumb to that peer pressure, and then you try it, and then you get hooked on it. And I guess, yeah, those are the 2 main things. I'd say like that creates that second part about like you being suggested to try it. There's like 2 sides of school that I see. one where like drugs and cannabis and not just cannabis, like vapes, things like that, all of those different things are like stigmatized. I myself don't do, but like I always I'm surrounded by people who say something like, okay, oh, there's like vaping in the bathroom and things like that. And of course that's a problem. But then that kind of, for the people who are actually doing that, then it kind of makes them not be able to like share their basically share their opinion and get some help because they feel like they can't, because no one people look down upon them. So then the people who are doing it together, that's the other side of school. Those that group of students, then they feel like, okay, they can do it because they're surrounded by other people who are doing it, and so there isn't really much of a problem. But in fact, it is a problem. So that's kind of what I've seen from my side. So.
Do you see like classmates that you can tell are also struggling with mental health issues that are using it, or do you think that that's more kind of kept to the personal level?
I'd say like it's definitely kept to a personal level. Like sometimes in class you might like see a classmate or something like, I know maybe not my recent memory, but like maybe like last year or a couple times, you might just see a classmate and they just don't look to be present. And I'm also not very good at like telling the signs that someone's like high or something like that, or they've recently used it. But I know people have told me, oh, this is like this person's not here, or they look like they've recently used it. Um and there's that. And what was the second part of your question?
If you think that they're kind of keeping things, if there's a concern about mental health, and it is somebody who's using, do you think that they're keeping that more to themselves, that there's like another piece to the puzzle, that they're struggling in a pretty significant way?
I'd say there definitely is, or like there's usually something related to that, like because, well, it's either like you tried just because you want to be like accepted by your friends, or okay, that piece about, okay, you're struggling with this thing at school, or there's some kind of background mental health problem that pushes you to that.
My perspective as a person in recovery is that we shouldn't be educating as much directly on the substance itself, but on substance abuse disorder. Because at the end of the day, it could have been anything for me. It just happened to be THC. It was one of them. But another one for me was like alcohol, which is entirely legal. And many people do use normally, recreationally, socially. They go out to a bar, have a couple beers. I can't do it. And I think that's because I just have substance abuse disorder and it runs in my family. And I'm more predisposed to develop one because of underlying mental health issues. I just knew that it was something that people did socially. And that was still the same way in college. I have many friends had many friends who did have the capability to use these substances once a month when they were at a party and someone else is smoking, like doing that. But I was not one of those people. It was a self-medicating issue. It was once I start, I can't stop. It was an issue with being sober. Generally, I felt really like I was just crawling out of my skin when there wasn't any sort of substance in my body. And I think just as like another completely legal substance, like alcohol could have become a problem for me, THC became a problem for me. But I do think the potency can actually be pretty dangerous for someone at least who has a problem like me. Because once I started, I was not stopping, and there were actual times where I went to the hospital for being just like so absurdly high. I'm not sure that necessarily is something that happens to just like a normal person who, they get the feeling and then they just stop. But I was always kind of like pushing the limit of how high I could feel. And the really potent ones, like edibles, dabs, like oils and stuff like that, made it really easy for me to continue to push the envelope on, like, okay, how much of this can I get into my body, and like how out of myself can I get through putting this in.
So you start chasing the high,
Exactly.
and then that's how eventually it can lead to other things, right?
Yeah.
So I think something that I wanted to go back that you said was, one thing you wish you would have known was that there was a predisposition for substance use disorder in your family. And I think along with that also goes, the predisposition for mental health disorders. When we're talking about specifically THC, something that just speaking with parents, that there's not an awareness of, is that if there is like an underlying mental health disorder or the predisposition to something like schizophrenia or some kind of, psychosis potential, when you're smoking marijuana the first time even, and you're young, obviously, then there can just be this early onset of psychosis. And if you stop using marijuana, it may not stop. So you may continue to go into psychosis as like a longer lasting impact. And that is something that we absolutely see with our kids a lot. And it's not really understood until we sit down and we're like, listen, this is potentially what's happening here. And it's scary because you can't guarantee them that if they stop using, it's never going to happen again. So having all of that information, I think for a parent, talking to your kids at a young age about the things that exist in the family that they should really carry into, their childhood, adolescence, as they're learning more and more about themselves, having that information is incredibly important. And I think if we're not talking about it as parents, then we're doing kids a disservice. So, I mean, it doesn't mean it's going to stop the kid from using or trying something. It doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to happen, but go into it with all the information possible.
Right. I think it like really helped my parents tremendously to know that I was not, I didn't become a burnout just because I wanted to. I was suffering. I was like escaping the feeling of being within myself because I couldn't face whatever it was. And for them to have more education on underlying mental health disorders, but also just substance use disorder, allowed them to treat me with a lot of grace, to the extent that when I was ready to receive help, my parents were the first people to know. Like what a blessing that is. And I think that was only because they met me with a lot of, I mean, at times anger, of course, but a lot of like grace and compassion, because they didn't just see me as like a mess up who was just like burning her life to the ground because I wanted to, like just for fun, they saw it as like I lost myself, and they weren't mad. I mean, at times they were mad that like legalization of marijuana, I moved to a state where it was legal, where like that existed, and it made it so easy for me to access it. But it was more about a parent like seeing their child just suffer, and I think I have an issue with legalization just in the same way I have an issue with the government making money off of liquor sales tax. It's a benefiting from something that can really harm someone, or like taxes that the government makes off of gambling, like people are using it as a way to escape themselves. And I just think that's not fully right.
Like, why exactly is legalization happening with all of these things, these underlying problems with cannabis?
Well, so the legalization isn't meant for kids. So, if we're starting at the young adult age, then really the goal is that you have pushed the age out farther, like alcohol, but kids don't necessarily realize like this isn't for us, this is for an adult. If that's we're to say it's for somebody, it's not for a kid. But just like with alcohol, that I think that age boundary can go out the window. And that's why educating on the difference between an adolescent using THC versus an adult using THC, like there really are actual physiological differences in the brain. And it comes down to how the THC is attaching to your your brain receptors, and your adolescent is going to stay high longer, get higher than compared to an adult. That's just because of where they are in their development. So there are actual significant differences between the adolescent and the adult using it. So, and your like long-term effects, you can see a decrease in IQ. I mean, you talked a lot about the emotional stuff. So that's all definitely real. And I think obviously when you're a teenager, when you're like 17 and you're in it, you're not thinking about what's going to happen in 4 years. You're like, it's here now. This is what I care about. So that's a hard concept for us to sell a kid on. And I think sometimes to a 17-year-old or teenager, what's happening right now is life. So if they're in a really rough situation, for them, that is all they have. They're not able to take a step back a lot of times and see this is a bump in the road for you. Your life has so much more, and this isn't what it's going to be forever. So you're struggling right now and you're going to be able to get through it, but they also have to believe that. So, when you're talking about just typical teen stuff, compound that with underlying mental health disorder and then putting substances on top of it. Well, thank you all for being here and having this chat with us. It was nice to meet you all, and hopefully I'll get to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very helpful.